What would you do to save your son? This is the central question posed to the player in Heavy Rain, the second in the loosely tied together David Cage trilogy.
Heavy Rain was the first game I'd played by Quantic Dream, and I have to admit that at the time it blew me away. I just graduated high school when I got the game, and it was the first game I played through completely on the PS3.
The solemn story and unbelievable graphics for the time mixed with what I thought to be innovative gameplay won me over, and I praised the game for it.
Well, I'm older now, my tastes have changed, and my ability to critique has gotten far better. I have to admit, after the hilarity that was Fahrenheit, I was a bit concerned that Heavy Rain wasn't going to hold up as well as I'd remembered. Had I built the game up too much in my mind over the years, or is it actually still a decent game?
Heavy Rain's presentation still holds up pretty well, with an attention to detail and textures that creates an atmosphere that feels real, with only a few things here and there feeling like they were haphazardly modeled. The animations, however, still feel rather awkward at times. Drying off with a towel, for example, looks awkward when compared to the rest of the game's graphical fidelity. The highly detailed facial animations are also both a blessing and a curse, sometimes looking amazing, while others looking just off enough to make them clash with the voice acting. The environments, however, are extremely detailed and fun to explore. They truly felt like real locations, and everything from the lighting to rain effects really helped to set the tone and atmosphere as intended, though the brighter moments at the beginning of the game did seem to be trying a bit too hard to create a contrast with the later sections of the game.
Much like in my Fahrenheit review, I feel it is important to point out that I'm only being this detail-oriented and nitpicky because the game had a certain goal and style in mind. If this were a platformer, I wouldn't be paying nearly this much attention to these little details.
While the game is beginning to show its age, I was still able to get sucked into the presentation only shortly after I'd started playing, despite the stranger quirks in the graphical design. As long as you're prepared for the whole Uncanny Valley concept to seep its way into the experience, you should be fine. The music is a huge step up from the last title, being both orally pleasing while also keeping the tone and setting reflected perfectly. The creators of Heavy Rain had a rather distinct challenge to overcome that a lot of other game developers don't. Most games have songs composed purposefully either to match up with gameplay scenarios or cinematic moments. Heavy Rain, on the other hand, had to perform a rather delicate balancing act by creating songs that would feel cinematic and reactive at the same time. This is something I feel the Heavy Rain team should be applauded for, as they succeeded in this area. It also helped that some of the tracks were good enough that I enjoyed listening to them even outside of the game, while the rest are at least functional when they aren't memorable. It should be noted that when it comes to games, I'm far more stickler for sound design than I am for graphical presentation. That being said, the most appalling thing about Heavy Rain's design is how big of a step backwards the voice acting took when compared to the last entry. All of the main members of the cast have moments where their lines just aren't natural sounding, but some performances are obviously affected by this worse than others. Unfortunately, the worst offender of all just happens to be the lead character, Ethan Mars.
That's of course if we ignore the horrendous child actors.
Jason, you really shouldn't let her off like that, you know? There's an awful lot of people in here.
Please, Dad, can I have one? I would really love to have one. Please, Dad, come on.
Okay, let's go buy a balloon.
Great!
Hey, champ! What's your name?
Jason.
Which balloon would you like, Jason?
The red one.
Here you go. That'll be $2, sir.
Jason, wait for me. Wait for your dad, son.
Nothing he says sounds sincere, and it's rather frustrating to listen to. Upon watching the bonus features that came with the game, I learned the reasoning, that being that all the actors are French and were attempting to fake American accents. The lead in particular really struggled with this, and it really hurt my immersion. Awkward tonal shifts in the acting are also frequent because of the free-flowing nature of the gameplay and dialogue choices, creating moments where it seems as though your characters are having mood swings. It made me chuckle at a few points and remained a small yet nagging distraction throughout the story, but it was never enough to shatter my enjoyment entirely. Don't get me wrong, all of the actors, excluding the children, had incredible moments in their performances, and I truly believe the characters were people at times. But it felt like almost every time I got truly invested in a scene, someone would deliver an awkward line that ruined the mood a bit. While I was able to look past this, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of other people can't, so keep that in mind if you're thinking about taking the plunge for yourself.
Overall, the presentation served its purpose. Heavy Rain's goal is to create a visually cinematic experience, and in that regard I feel it succeeded, as long as you ignore the bad vocal delivery.
While Fahrenheit felt like a testing ground for this gameplay style, I feel Heavy Rain finally took full advantage of it. There were moments of actual brilliance in the design that I feel are often overlooked because they're just thrown under the broad banner of QuickTime events, and I find that to be a bit disheartening. While, yes, the QuickTime event moniker has been painted as an ugly one, the designers of said actions here did a great job of creating context-sensitive movements that actually made sense inside of the game world. For example, if your character is moving something left, they will have you push the analog stick to the left. If you're turning a key, the game will have you use a quarter circle motion. The developers really took advantage of the control scheme and player instincts to create a fluid and intuitive experience. They even took this a step further to not only make the movements intuitive, but also make players empathize with the characters on screen. The game often asked me to do intricate button holds that had me contorting my hands into awkward positions. This worked wonderfully because even though it is on a small scale, it is a way of making the player share in the discomfort that the in-game character is experiencing, especially when you are forced to hold these combinations for long periods of time. This way of thinking even carried over to the dialogue sections, as when your character is under a lot of stress, the word choices will spin and blur around your character to make them harder to read, mimicking the difficulty the character is facing in making said conversational choices, especially when faced with a time limit. It's a strange and highly effective means of creating immersion that I don't feel gets enough credit. Heavy Rain has more than a few brilliant gameplay scenarios that leave the game feeling organic despite using a very clear set of variables. There's one moment where you are given the opportunity to sneak up on a guy robbing a convenience store to knock him out, but if you are caught in the process, you still have the chance to talk the robber out of it. If you fail at that as well, you still have one last opportunity to attack the robber outright. It created a scenario where it actually felt like I was role-playing as opposed to relying on usual video game logic. As a huge fan of tabletop RPGs, this is something I greatly appreciated. At that moment, I was the character, and not just watching the scene as a spectator. There are also a few moments where the game asks you to remember things that you normally may not be paying a lot of attention to. What color clothes was your son wearing when he was kidnapped? What items did you touch in this store? Little things to keep you on your toes to make sure you weren't taking the very film-like presentation for granted. It was moments like this that showed that at least a couple people on the team actually understood what makes good game design. While there was less variety in the types of action scenes presented in Heavy Rain compared to Fahrenheit, all the action scenes in Heavy Rain felt much more integral to the story. It really balanced out to create an enjoyable experience in that regard as well. I'm happy to announce that the annoying Simon-like prompts from Fahrenheit are gone, instead replaced with a much cleaner interface that simply shows transparent button icons on screen. I felt this was a brilliant compromise as it clearly indicates what actions you need to take while not covering up the scene taking place behind it. If I really wanted to get nitpicky about the QuickTime event controls, the only things I can think of are that every once in a while the game wouldn't recognize a 6-axis movement properly. That and the quarter circle-like movements on the second analog stick were similarly misread due to the sensitivity of the directions. The only other issue occurred at one particular moment where I knew exactly what I wanted my character to do, but the button prompt assigned to that action was unclear, making me choose a path I didn't intend to. It was only so irritating because it occurred at a very key moment that would have had drastic repercussions on the rest of the story.
Frankly, it left me feeling cheated because I knew what I was intending to do, and it wasn't skill keeping me from doing so, but instead a lack of clarity.
That being said, while the game succeeded with the more complicated and intricate gameplay moments, it struggled with some of the most basic. There were numerous occasions where just getting my character to walk in the correct direction became a chore. To be fair, this was also an issue in Fahrenheit, but I neglected to mention it because it happened rarely. In Heavy Rain, on the other hand, it was a fairly common occurrence. The strange static camera angles mixed with an even stranger set of tank controls that has you moving forward by holding the R2 button led to some rather infuriating situations, though for the majority of the game it is functional enough that I was able to get used to it.
Much like how Fahrenheit brought up a discussion about what should and shouldn't be considered a game, Heavy Rain brings up a rather interesting debate about how much choice affects a player's experience.
Now obviously no video game gives players true freedom, as every possible outcome had to be coded into the title in the first place, but branching narratives have become all the more popular and common as time has gone on, and it's usually what people think of when they bring up choices in gaming. Of course, anytime you do anything in a game you are given choices, and these choices already have consequences, even in something as simple as Super Mario Bros. For example, in this scenario, do you jump on top of the Goomba or run into it? One path leads to your death, while the other leads to your survival and the death of the enemy. There are other choices presented to you as well. For example, you can jump over the creature entirely, allowing for both of you to survive. As gaming moved into a 3D space, the choices available became even more numerous. For this example, I'd be using Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, because I'm an MGS fanboy and I felt like playing it some more. Anyway, in this scenario, what angle should I strike from? What weapon should I choose? Should I be sneaky or go in guns blazing?
I only bring this up because it's so often overlooked when choice is brought up in a gaming sense. And doesn't it kind of ruin Heavy Rain's mantra of all your choices having consequences? Because, of course they do. As they do in every video game.
This works as a detriment to Heavy Rain's marketing campaign, but also a boost because more important than giving players choice is giving players the illusion of choice. Here, let me explain it a bit better. Heavy Rain gives you a myriad of dialogue options, all of which steer the conversation in a different direction, but very few have an actual lasting impact on the game. Likewise, the game touts how the QuickTime events could actually kill off your characters, and if you do die, the game just continues without that character from then on. This is a very interesting mechanic, of course, and those two systems combined leave players constantly on edge when trying to discover what the correct actions to take are. But players who have played Heavy Rain more than once will be unsurprised to see how little the game actually changes with the player's choices. Dialogue scenarios almost always lead to the same conclusions, and the times you can actually die in the action sequences are limited to only a small handful. Almost all of the tension the game creates is artificial, and the actual amount of control the player is given is minor at best. My argument here is that this actually doesn't matter because first-time players will feel like they are constantly in danger. They will feel like their dialogue choices will have effects on the overall experience. In that regard, I can't call Heavy Rain anything other than a success. If it hadn't been marketed as a cinematic experience with large consequences, I don't think nearly as many players would have gone in and been so willingly overtaken by the tension and pressure that the game so desperately wants you to feel. Of course, this means that multiple playthroughs are all but useless in terms of getting a new experience, but much like the films the game tries so hard to emulate, it doesn't necessarily have to be a new experience to still be enjoyable. Before I get into backlash, yes, I am aware that your choices do matter in at least a small sense, as the game brags about its 22 possible ending combinations. But let's face it, there are only a small handful of endings available and only one true ending. The truly important thing when it comes to games with branching narratives is that players feel like they are making important decisions, and the ability to mask the behind-the-scenes variables, especially for first-time players, which for a lot of players will be their only trip through the game, is what truly makes these sorts of experiences stand out. Unlike more recent examples like, let's just say Dragon Age Inquisition, which made it very clear that none of your choices mattered, Heavy Rain is able to keep up the facade until the credits begin, or at least until you are far enough along that you will no longer care. Heavy Rain follows 4 characters, all of whom are working to catch a murderer known widely as the Origami Killer, who is a man who kidnaps and murders children, but only at the time of the year when rainfall is at its peak. He then leaves his trademark origami figure in the hand of his victim, so in other words, another murder mystery from the man that brought us... Fahrenheit. All joking aside, in a lot of ways it does feel like Fahrenheit was a rough draft for Heavy Rain, as they share a lot of the same plot beats, even going so far as one recording the temperature while the other records rainfall. Of course, there are a lot of other similarities as well that may as well be David Cage trademarks by the look of it. Obvious comparisons begin with the murder mystery, not to mention the poorly written female lead, the infamous David Cage sex scenes, the cemetery, the infatuation with police officers in the police department, the lead being on the run from the cops, the childhood flashback sequences, etc. There are even going to be some supernatural elements in Heavy Rain until they were removed at the last minute. I'm not bringing these issues up to nitpick, as artists often have recurring themes in their work. I just think it is interesting that these two games in particular are so similar, and yet one turned out good while the other, well, we already talked about that one. Just goes to show how much the smallest of changes can alter an experience.
Or in other words, keep Mayan oracles out of your murder mystery story.
Alright, we are officially moving into spoilery waters at this point. While I could try and describe some of the game's plot while avoiding spoilers, there are places all over the internet where you can find that, so I'm just going to jump in so I can freely discuss everything I want to. This is your last warning. I guess we should start the same way I started my experience with Heavy Rain. When I first played this game, I started by playing through the non-canon tech demo titled The Taxidermist, which stars Madison Paige as she tries to get evidence about a murder suspect, only to break into his house to look for evidence on her own. It's actually a pretty interesting and concise chunk of gameplay that shows what you can expect from Heavy Rain as a whole. The first time I played through The Taxidermist with no ideas of what I was doing or even a real grip on the creative control scheme that Heavy Rain was built around, I had one of my most memorable gaming moments of all time. The fear I felt while hiding from the maniac killer in his own house was one of the most powerful emotions I've ever experienced in a video game.
Upon playing it again, of course, there's no way I can relive that experience. The helplessness and dread I felt is gone. It isn't fresh.
That being said, I implore new players not to start with The Taxidermist. In my experience, there's nothing in the entirety of the main story that is even remotely as gripping or terrifying as the moments in the tech demo, and that in itself is enough to ruin the impact of most of the main game's best moments. Now that we have the tech demo out of the way, let's get into the real story of Heavy Rain. A very important difference between the storytelling styles of Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain is that despite both of them being murder mysteries at their core, Fahrenheit only asked how, while Heavy Rain is still asking who, how, and why. Having the main hero not be the killer, despite some rather flawed attempts at framing him towards the beginning of the game, creates for an initially much more riveting story than Fahrenheit could have ever hoped to achieve. Leaving the player as well as the main character blind to what is happening gives a much more powerful motivation for the player to push forward, especially when all of those answers are fed to the player in slow and purposeful drops. That was the thing I personally enjoyed most about Heavy Rain. The characters are, Well, I was gonna say better than Fahrenheit, but that doesn't mean much considering the only character I cared about in that game was basically the comic relief. Here, on the other hand, there were two characters I cared about. At least a little. Here, this will be way easier if I just give you a character-by-character breakdown, so here we go. Ethan, being the lead, is once again the most boring character in the entire game, but at least this time he has a believable motivation and is actually sympathetic to a point. He starts the game as a sort of perfect being, an architect by trade with a beautiful house, loving wife, and 2 kids. Tragedy strikes for the man, however, when one fateful day his idiot of a son wanders into traffic and gets hit by a car.
Now, I understand that the last statement I just made can be taken as offensive, but if you played the game, you'll understand why I have no sympathy for these children whatsoever.
He's a complete and utter idiot, continually wandering away from his father despite being told not to. It doesn't help that the voice acting is so awful that I just can't take him seriously regardless. Now, because this is the internet, let me spell this out as clearly as possible. This is not an insult to real children. This is not an attack on all the poor families who have actually had to face this tragedy or something like this happening to them. But in the context of the game and its story, it is handled in the most hokey way possible. Anyway, after attempting to save his son from said car accident, Ethan's life goes down the drain. He and his wife divorce and share custody of their remaining son. Ethan is struck with depression from the guilt he carries over not saving his son, and if that weren't enough, he also has blackouts where he wanders around without any idea of what is happening to him. If all of this wasn't enough to make you feel bad for the poor sap, his remaining child is eventually kidnapped by the infamous origami killer, and Ethan is forced to go through 5 terrible trials as a means to find him before his son dies. Ethan is obviously the character the plot revolves around, and while a bit generic, it works well at setting up the core dilemma. The other 3 main characters are all after the origami killer for their own reasons, but Ethan is clearly the character we are supposed to sympathize with most, and it does work. Kinda. If it weren't for the trials he had to go through, I'd find no real enjoyment in his sections of the game. Perhaps he was left intentionally bland and nondescript so players could project onto him? I don't know, and I don't really feel like making excuses for his arguably bad writing, so let's move along. Next, there's Norman Jayden, the FBI detective with future technology and a drug problem. He's actually pretty interesting, and I like the gameplay style they went for with him. Actually having to look for clues and use a bit of deductive reasoning to lead him in the correct direction. I feel he's most notable because his style of gameplay is the one that most represents the adventure games of old that this trilogy has been trying so hard to break away from. I actually wish his sections of the game had been developed further. I'd like to play a game like this without all the other characters surrounding it because there's so much potential here. Perhaps I'll try this one later. Anyway, continuing the discussion of characters, why is Madison even in this game? She is so useless to the game's story that her first scene is literally a dream. She serves as a support character to Ethan and as a plot device and nothing more. From a gameplay perspective, it is nice to get a third chance to get all the clues to find out who the real killer is instead of just 2, but from a story perspective, they really failed to do anything interesting with her. I guess it was just an excuse to bring back the now famous David Cage sex scene, am I right? I live for this shit. That's 2 for 2 when it comes to making hilariously bad female characters in your games, David Cage. Your next game actually stars a female. Hope you don't screw it up a 3rd time. Last but not least is Scott Shelby, the fan favorite. The game does a brilliant job of making him sympathetic as well as a badass. He's a no-nonsense private eye, but also a nurturer and provider. Look at him taking care of the baby. Though his sections are some of the most fun, they also feel the most removed from the rest of the game. It's hard to explain, but all 3 of the other characters have stories that are more interlinked, while his kind of plays out on the sideline. The game is filled with brilliant story moments and intense scenes that will keep players entertained. The pacing is also surprisingly good, following through with the style that Fahrenheit started with before shit got weird. As I played through the game, both the slow and fast moments had me enthralled. The action scenes always felt tense, the story segments always had me wanting to know what was going to happen next. Each character has at least one moment that had me feeling rather frantic, but Ethan and his trials are what I feel most people will be most affected by, and while I did enjoy them, there's one thing I want to discuss with fans of this title. I don't really understand the popular opinion that the finger amputation scene is the climax of the game. In fact, I found it downright mundane in comparison to the following trial where you are forced to decide if you should kill another person or not.
I guess I just couldn't get past the game logic of it all. I just knew there wouldn't be any repercussions for removing my character's pinky finger, while killing another character in the game could.
Maybe being a murderer would mean that even if Ethan did save his son, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Maybe actually becoming a murderer would give Ethan PTSD. Maybe that character would have been important on another character's plotline down the road. Of course, I came to find out that none of these things were factors either, but in the initial moment of said scenes, one consequence felt like it held much more weight than the other. In the case of this particular scene, I'm not trying to call anyone out, I'm more asking for it to be explained to me because both I and a friend who played through the game with me didn't find it gripping at all, really. It wasn't a bad scene, and in fact the number of options given to you seems almost sadistically creative on the side of the developers, but it just wasn't as gripping as it could have been, in my opinion.
This made me think about the psychology involved in separating game logic from real logic, and while I'd love to explore that more, I've already gone into one game design rant here as it is, so I think I'll save that for a later video.
As much as I enjoyed Heavy Rain's story on the surface level, as soon as you begin dissecting it with any bit of scrutiny, it begins to fall apart. There are a multitude of plot holes and plot conveniences that could really drag you out of the experience if you notice them, and that is something that is hard to defend. You will either have to be sucked into the story so much that you don't notice, as I was on my first playthrough, or you'll need to carry a high suspension of disbelief. There wasn't anything too terribly contrived, at least for the murder mystery genre anyway, except for one major plot point that has angered fans since the game's initial release. The reveal that Scott Shelby is the origami killer is fucking horrendous, and not because of who the character is, but because of the cheap and frankly pathetic tactics used to cover up his identity in the first place. It is extremely frustrating because the game actually drops several subtle clues that point out his true identity. The fact that he has an old typewriter on his desk, the fact that you can see him wearing the policeman's watch, early inside knowledge that he presents that no one else would possibly know. It had all the small details that make murder mysteries great, but it was thrown completely out the window with just one bullshit scene.
Been a while since Manfred went into his office. I should take a look.
Hello?
Manfred!
Hello? Your call is logged, sir. A police car will be there in a few minutes. I need to know who you are, sir. Sir? Hello?
Oh my God! He's dead. Oh, God.
Seems innocent enough on its own, right? Until you see what the game hid from you towards the end of the game. It is so stupendously awful that I couldn't comprehend it, and it almost ruined the entire game for me in a matter of seconds. If you played through the game and hate it because of this moment, I can't blame you at all. It is doubly frustrating because I actually like the idea of the most likable character in the game secretly being the villain. I love his depressing and sickening but somehow still believable and almost empathy-inducing motivation for his crimes. I mean, yes, it is completely irrational and he obviously has some severe mental issues, but as far as the genre is concerned, it is nothing too out of the ordinary, and I liked it! I really can't overstate what a poor decision this was. The game outright lies to you to keep its dirty secret, and the worst part is it didn't need to. There are multiple ways this could have been fixed to not make it come off as such bullshit. Simply end the scene early instead of lying to us about it. That's an equally cheap tactic, but at least you aren't feeding false information in an inorganic way. The character's death wasn't needed anyway. The clock shop owner was clearly friends with Shelby. Why didn't the writers just let him borrow the books? This isn't even the only time the writers flat out lie. Scott Shelby, much like the other characters, has inner thoughts that you can listen to at any time, and Shelby's are all fabricated to keep him from showing his true motivations. Why add this mechanic if you're gonna have to backpedal on it anyway?
Damn it, David Cage, man. Fahrenheit was awful. This was sizing up to be an actually decent story, and then you fucking ruin it. You just take all this good stuff and throw it out the window like it... Just... Keep going.
Just bear with me while I try to come up with an analogy here. It's like being offered a delicious dessert. You eat it, enjoy it, but then you're told by the chef that he put laxatives in it. Doesn't that just ruin the whole fucking experience? I mean, yes, you get to enjoy the dessert, but you have to suffer through all the painful shitting later, and it makes you wonder if it's even worth it. Just, Okay, let's just move on before I suffer any more blood pressure issues. The problem inherent with a narrative like the one contained in Heavy Rain is you can never get the full effect of it on a second viewing. Once you know who the murderer is and how the overall story plays out, there's no real incentive to see it again. Heavy Rain tries to sidestep this problem by changing all the small segments in between with varying outcomes, but because the story hinges so firmly on the mystery, I don't personally feel that it is enough to warrant a second playthrough, even when you take the game's multiple endings into consideration. Besides, the game clearly has one true ending that it's obviously pointing you towards, making all the rest feel cheap and unimportant by comparison. In fact, the more I think on it, I'd strongly advise against a second playthrough, as it will likely color your enjoyment of the game in a very negative light. Despite some minor issues and the one glaring flaw in the game's storytelling, I feel that Heavy Rain mostly succeeds at doing what it set out to do. The story in itself is captivating, the main cast was at worst serviceable and at best strong, and the momentum of the story, while admittedly slow at first, builds into a perfectly paced rush towards the finish line as things become more hectic. Most importantly of all is that I was actually able to take this game's story seriously from beginning to end, unlike its predecessor. Yes, there are plot holes, yes, there are issues here and there that cheapen the experience, but no more than the vast majority of stories that it is already paying homage to. Fans of the genre of storytelling should have no problem overlooking a lot of these issues on a first playthrough, while those of the more discerning eye may admittedly want to steer clear.
I can honestly say that despite all the issues, I enjoyed Heavy Rain for what it was. A decent murder mystery with quite a few hiccups along the way.
Unlike Fahrenheit, it succeeds more than it doesn't, and aside from some nitpicky control issues, the only thing that really took me out of the experience was the bad vocal performances and the egregious twist. It took the formula the first game presented and brought it to a level that made it successful. While it's not a game that I can recommend to anyone, it is a game that I can recommend to people with a bit more willingness to experience something that is different and are willing to suspend their disbelief. It really comes down to whether or not the good moments outweigh the hackneyed ones, and for me, they did. I think Heavy Rain is a good game. Not great, but good, and I'm glad that I got the chance to play it. Next time, we're wrapping up the infamous and loosely called trilogy with Beyond Two Souls. Did David Cage and friends continue to improve, or do things take a turn for the strange once more? I guess we'll find out next time on Stiles Series Synopsis.
Hello everyone, and congratulations for making it this far. Thank you for joining me on this new experimental take on Stiles Series Synopsis. And hey, if you want more of that content, you can click over in this area somewhere for my Stiles Series Synopsis on the first Breath of Fire game. Or if you want to see what I'm kept referencing whenever I mentioned Fahrenheit, you can click right over here for the first David Cage entry. That'll be all for today. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, please comment, like, share, subscribe, especially subscribe. If you have constructive criticism, it is always welcome. Constructive being the key word there. Otherwise, you can say whatever you want. It is the internet. No, just do what you gotta do. Anyway, that'll be all for today. See you guys later.